tried to erase him, to crush his people, to rewrite the story of resistance. But history remembers Tenamaztle, the fierce chieftain who defied the Spanish Empire and lit a flame of rebellion that still burns in the heart of Mexico. Born into the Nahua world during the early 1500s, Tenamaztle emerged not as a king in the European sense, but as a leader forged in the fire of colonization, chosen by his people to stand against one of the most brutal campaigns of conquest in the Americas, the Mixtón War. Tenamaztle was likely born around 1500 in the region of conquest land. In what is now the state of Zacatecas, belonged to the Caxcan people, one of the many indigenous groups in northern Mesoamerica who lived in organized societies long before the Spanish ever set foot on their lands. These were agricultural peoples with thriving trade networks, spiritual systems, and systems of governance. Tenamaztle rose to prominence not through inheritance or wealth, but through courage, wisdom, and his ability to unite diverse groups under a single cause: survival. By the time Tenamaztle was a young man, the Spanish conquest of central Mexico was already in full motion. The Aztec Empire had fallen. Hernan Cortes and his men were carving up the land, enslaving indigenous populations and replacing traditional systems with European domination. The conquistadors weren't just soldiers, they were colonizers backed by a violent ideology of superiority and a hunger for gold and labor. In 1530, the Spanish began their push into the northern frontier, targeting indigenous towns and forcing the people into submission. Initially, the Spanish sought to use diplomacy, offering gifts and demanding loyalty to the crown. But when the people of Noquistlan resisted, they were met with brutal force. Tenamaztle saw what was coming. He witnessed the burning of villages, the kidnapping of women and children, and the forced labor of his people in encomiendas, a system where indigenous lives were traded for the promise of servitude and Christian conversion. In 1540, with his homeland under siege, Tenamaztle led an uprising that would become one of the fiercest rebellions in colonial Mexican history, the Mixtón War, named after the rugged terrain of the Mixtón Mountains, where the rebels made their last stand. This was not a spontaneous revolt. It was a coordinate, multi-ethnic resistance that brought together the Caxcans, Zacatecas, Tipuhans, and other indigenous nations of the northern plateau. Tenamaztle was not just a warrior. He was a strategist. He understood that open warfare against Spanish steel and cavalry was suicide. So he used the land to his advantage. He built fortresses on mountaintops, organized ambushes in narrow canyons, and developed a communication network that kept the resistance agile and unpredictable. His leadership turned scattered resistance into an organized rebellion that rattled the colonial order. The Spanish, shocked by the scale of the uprising, sent one of their most experienced commanders, Cristobal de Oñate, but even Oñate couldn't break the resistance. As Spanish forts fell and colonial routes were disrupted, the Viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza, took direct control. He brought an army of over 50,000 men, a force larger than any that had been used since the fall of the Aztec capital. It included Spanish soldiers, indigenous allies, and enslaved African laborers, all conscripted to crush the rebellion. Even under this immense pressure, Tenamaztle and his allies held out for months. Their courage inspired thousands of others across the region to resist. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the Spanish might lose their grip on the northern territories, but the empire was relentless. By late 1541, after bloody battles and sieges, the rebels were finally overwhelmed. Many were slaughtered, and the survivors were sold into slavery or scattered across distant lands. Tenamaztle, however, escaped. He vanished into the northern highlands, evading capture for years. While the Spanish declared victory, Tenamaztle became a living symbol of defiance, a ghost they could never truly silence. But this story doesn't end in hiding. It ends in confrontation, not on the battlefield, but in the very heart of colonial power. In 1550, nearly a decade after the Mixtón War, Tenamaztle did something unthinkable. He voluntarily appeared in Mexico City, not as a prisoner, but as a representative of his people. He came not to surrender, but to seek justice. He demanded an audience with the highest legal authority in the land, the Audiencia of New Spain. And when the colonial courts failed to listen, he went even further. He took his case all the way to Spain. Yes, Tenamaztle, an indigenous rebel leader, crossed the Atlantic Ocean to plead his people's case before the Spanish crown. With the help of sympathetic friars like Bartolomé de las Casas, who had begun to denounce the atrocities of the conquest, Tenamaztle stood before the Royal Council in Madrid and accused the Spanish government of genocide. He spoke of massacres, forced conversions, slavery, and broken promises, and he did so with dignity, intelligence, and unshakable conviction. This moment, an indigenous leader standing in the halls of European power, demanding justice for his people, remains one of the most remarkable acts of resistance in colonial history. Tenamaztle wasn't just a warrior, he was a diplomat, a visionary, a leader who refused to be reduced to a footnote in someone else's empire. What happened to him after that journey remains a mystery. Some say he died in Spain, never to return home. Others believe he returned to Mexico and lived out his days among his people in quiet resistance. But no matter where his body lies, his legacy endured. Today, Tenamaztle is honored as a national hero in statues bear his image, and his name is invoked in struggles for indigenous rights across Latin America. He represents a different kind of leadership, one that doesn't seek conquest or domination, but the protection of a people, a land, and a way of life. His story reminds us that colonization was not a one-sided march of progress, but a battlefield of resistance, resilience, and memory. That even in the darkest moments, there were those who stood up and said, "No more." Tenamaztle's life is not just a relic of the past, it is a mirror held up to the present, in a world where indigenous voices are still fighting to be heard. His journey from mountain warrior to courtroom advocate offers a powerful example of what resistance can look like, not only with weapons, but with truth. This is the story of Tenamaztle, the rebel chief who took on an empire and refused to be forgotten.